turned it on. Am I on? Can you hear me? Are we... Well, lovely to see you all. All this bunch of old fogies all gathered together. And I'm one of them. Time only goes in one direction, doesn't it? Sadly. Upwards in terms of the numbers. Anyway, it's great to be with you. I'll come back to the military piece in a moment in terms of what Ken has said. But I've got a mission this morning, like all good military men, or military people, I should say, in today's world. The mission is to speak to you for about 40 minutes on this issue of, is religion a cause of war or a means of peace? And then I'm very happy to take some questions, and then we'll go for lunch and chat over lunch. But if I may be so bold, you have a mission too. Your mission is to listen and then give me a hard time in questions. But if you decide that you've finished your mission before I finish mine, then either snore quietly or leave and let the rest of us get on with it. So, having said that, it's important that I stress at the outset that I come at this issue, this question, which has been one I've thought through quite a lot over the years, from a purely military perspective, not from some sort of academic perspective. From my time in the army, which was 44 years, man and boy, around 43 years, man and boy. Started as a cadet, which I'll come back to. And my answer to the question, just to put it on the table to begin with, I don't know what your initial reaction is when you see the question. My answer to the question is good military parlance, or avoiding the issues, to say both and neither. And that's what we're going to come back to, both and neither. So before I start, let me manage your expectations in the context of what Ken has said. Can I put on the next slide, please? Which hopefully is a quote. When I do quite a lot of speaking, as Ken said, and this is my favorite quote. Anybody else ex-military? No, see, not unusual nowadays. Ah, right. Navy, Ren? Air Force. Oh, so I will forgive you. No. But my favorite quote is this, just to manage your expectations. H.G. Wells, reputed to have said, the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. So that is me. However, I'm also told that H.G. Wells met Stalin once and left thinking Stalin was quite a nice bloke. So maybe I don't need to worry too much about his views on life. Next slide, please. Just put up a blank if you would. So a great deal, of course, has been written about this issue. You probably won't be surprised to know that a recent survey found that half the UK population think religion does more harm than good, with many respondents declaring that most wars are started by religion, naming inevitably the Crusades as an example of that. Many also spoke about governments using religion for their own ends, including keeping people, especially women, as we know, in many places around the world, in their place, or inciting their populations to violence and war by abusing religion. And as a result, many today are indifferent to or skeptical of, if not critical of, religious belief, and would therefore call themselves secular or agnostic or atheist. And just most don't believe anymore in God. Although we are seeing this quiet revival that we may come back to. So with that in mind, in order to explain where I stand, let me begin by expanding a little on my military career and the experiences that have framed my views in the context of this conversation. The slide shows my military career. I also joined the army as a cadet when I was 13 in 1964, barely 20 years after D-Day. And the end of a war, of course, to defeat the evils of an essentially atheistic rule of National Socialism. At 16, I spent 2 years at the Army's Sixth Form College, arriving shortly after the beginning of the Six-Day War in June 1967. Some of you may remember that, between the Jewish state of Israel and a coalition of Muslim Arab states, the third such conflict since the establishment of Israel in 1948. 2 years at college, I then moved on to Sandhurst in 1969, just as the so-called Troubles were breaking out in Northern Ireland between Catholic and Protestant Christians. communities in the province separated by being Catholic or Protestant, endure throughout the whole of my career. One of the interesting things about being in the military is when you deploy on an operation, you get a medal, which is always quite important when you want to put your uniform on. They started giving medals for serving in Northern Ireland in 1970, 71. They stopped giving them the year I left the British Army in 2007. This was a very long, drawn-out campaign. After 2 years at the academy, I was commissioned in 1971. And I served in West Germany 4 times over the next 2 decades within what was called the Northern Army Group of NATO, part of the British Army of the Rhine, up against 3 shock army, Warsaw Pact, atheistic-led, Russian-led Warsaw Pact in that Cold War, with the potential, of course, for high-intensity warfighting and the exchange of nuclear weapons, which we all hoped had gone away, but is coming back, sadly, under Putin. In between, in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, also known as the Ramadan War, broke out between Israel and another Arab coalition, the majority of the combat taking place in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, which of course had been occupied by Israel during the 1967 war. Then there was a year in Northern Ireland in the late 1970s on terrorist and counter-insurgency operations, and a year then in a classic peacekeeping operation in Cyprus with the United Nations, patrolling the line between Greek Orthodox Christians and a mix of Muslim and secular Turks. Sadly, the end of the Cold War didn't bring peace, rather an immediate deployment on a war-fighting operation in the Middle East, when a Western Christian, but also including an Arab-Muslim coalition, faced up against Saddam Hussein, if you remember, who invaded and occupied Kuwait, a Muslim country. Saddam was effectively the secular dictator of a Muslim and Kurdish nation. That was followed by 3 peace support and peace enforcement operations in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, when Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks were divided along Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim fault lines after Tito's secular, national, and political alliances broke apart. And then 12 years after the First Gulf War, a more limited Western coalition invaded Iraq, and I deployed to Baghdad as Saddam's statue. You may remember the television pictures when they pulled Saddam's statue down, and I arrived in Baghdad at just about that time. Of course, very quickly to find myself in the middle of an insurgency and the beginning of a civil war between Sunni and Shia Muslims. So a whole raft of deployments with different faiths, different groupings, different divisions, all having a go at each other in various complex operations. And over those years, I experienced the reality and the brutality of warfare and saw something behind the headlines: the gangsters, the protection rackets, the greed, the desire for power, and experienced at first hand the bitterness of religious, ethnic, and cultural bigotry that divides our world and the brutality that flows from it. And I watched enough mass graves being dug up to learn that there are rarely such things as goodies and baddies in the business of violence. And working alongside a mix of military and media, diplomats and civil servants, a whole mass of NGOs and UN agencies, I tried to get to grips with what was going on in these various places. Why do people do this to each other? What's behind it all? Trying to understand the bitterness amongst and between religions and what lay behind the various brutal, secular and or atheistic regimes. Those conversations continue, of course, today, amidst the war in Gaza, which is going on after the October 7th massacres, alongside the war in Ukraine, and of course other campaigns, other wars in places like Nagorno-Karabakh and Sudan. And there were, and I don't think now are any simple answers to these questions. But next slide, please. I think in the context of today, those are the sort of 4 potential options that I think emerge from my experiences. The first option is that religion is not just a cause of war, but the most major cause of war the source of violence. Secondly, that if we seek a more peaceful world, we should, indeed must, abolish religion. Third, that religion is not a source of violence. People are made violent by things like fear, glory, and what Hobbes described as the perpetual and restless desire for power that ceases only in death. Religion, therefore, has nothing to do with it. Religion itself teaches us to love and forgive, not to fight. That's our third option. Fourth, that their religion, yes, that's the problem. That's the cause of violence, but not ours. We are for peace. They are for war. Now, my experiences tell me that none of these actually apply, and I'm going to go through them all in turn and just talk about each. So for the first, that religion is not just a cause, but the cause. Various organizations have surveyed around 1,800 conflicts that occurred over the last 3,500 years. In doing so, amongst others, the Encyclopedia of War, War Audit, the Institute for Peace and Economics, and the BBC found that in our world history of 3,500 years, there have only been around 280 years of probable worldwide peace. Of the rest, rated on a 0 to 5 scale, with 5 indicating the highest religious motivation, 60% were rated 0, with only just under 10% involving religion and being rated 3 or above. Some of those included undeniable barbarity, and we'll come back to those, like the Crusades and the 30 Years' War. But even then, Wikipedia notes that the origins of the 30 Years' War and the goals of the participants were complex, and no single cause can actually be described as the main reason for the fighting. Historians now also suggest that there were around 5,000 to 6,000 killed in the 300-odd years of the Inquisition, rather than the millions that are often thrown around in conversation and in the media. That's around 20 a year. 1 a year is terrible, but the picture is much more complex than is usually implied, and as in most conflicts, the reality appears to be a long way from what is often served up to us in the media in particular, but also in education and elsewhere. Religion does often provide a useful cover and powerful motivator to the evil-hearted. But the fact that it can be so markedly different in the hands of the power-hungry, as opposed to the altruistic and virtuous, really says more, I think, about human psychology than it does about religion. Which is why that many human conflicts that seem to involve religion, most of them actually don't. And it's also why, moving on to our second option, getting rid of religion is certainly no panacea. It will not solve the problem. We don't need to look far to see what happens when secular or atheistic regimes are established. Between them, Hitler's Germany, Napoleon's France, Stalin's Russia, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Mao's China, and Kim's North Korea represent a crude mix of nationalism, social Darwinism, and a sort of bastardized paganism. They are in effect the archetypal idolatrous societies. And what flowed and still flows from them reflects their worldview, a ruthless self-belief alongside an equally ruthless brutality. Believing in secular relativism means an absolute disregard for life. Hence Stalin's supposed remark that 1 death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 is a mere statistic. Those regimes that abuse religion or attempt to eliminate it usually authorize mass murder and genocide rather than produce peace and tranquility. And the numbers who die dwarf those killed alongside as a result of religion. Saddam may have made a show of praying on television, but he gassed and bombed the Kurds, and he was a tyrannical dictator. Stalin, Hitler, and Mao murdered millions in the name of political totalitarianism. Tens of thousands of Russian Christians were executed for their beliefs by atheists intent on purging religion from the Soviet Union, or from Russia as it then was. Hitler's regime used a quasi-mystical racist philosophy to exploit the idea of a master race and the ancient hatred of the Jews to callously murder untold millions. As we're seeing today, anti-Semitism is a light sleeper, and it is easily aroused. Mao's barbarous cultural revolution and forced collectivization of agriculture caused a famine that killed 50 million, and the Uyghurs, as we know, in Xinjiang province in China, are facing genocide because of their religion. To say such murderous totalitarianism has nothing to do with a secular or atheistic society that many want to bring into play in Western civilization, in this country and others, is to completely misunderstand, I think, both them and their ideologies on which their actions rested. And those who declare that we no longer need religion, or that they don't need any higher power to tell them the right way to behave, but that they simply need to be true to themselves, some sort of childish Girl Guide promise, seem to forget that Hitler, Stalin, and the rest were all presumably being true to themselves as they committed genocide against their own or other states' peoples, as Putin is doing today. New atheism assumed that as people abandoned Christianity, they would embrace a sort of enlightened secular position. But it doesn't take the brains of an evolutionary biologist to work out that it was mistaken in its diagnosis of what would follow religion's decline. The rational world we were promised hasn't materialized, and I would argue a nastier, less reasonable one is supplanting what was there before. I read the other day that Professor Dawkins has recently admitted that he considers himself to be a cultural Christian, betraying a certain level of cultural free riding, and an almost touching naivety that a post-Christian world would give way to a values-neutral space rooted in reason. At a dinner in London recently, Dawkins recounted a conversation that he'd had with Hitchens, the other one. You remember the famous four who were the great atheists. Do you ever worry, Dawkins asked, that if we win and destroy Christianity, then that vacuum would be filled with Islam? It's a curious question that reflects both perhaps an underlying hatred of Islam and Muslims by many new atheists, but also a deep disdain, arguing that we should destroy Christianity. It's hardly the language of the pure in heart. And it serves to reaffirm my long-held view that many like him, Dawkins, and there are many others like him around, are what my grandmother used to call an intellectual idiot, educated well beyond his intelligence. The bottom line is that whilst religion and irreligion may be cultural variables, killing is a human constant. Among other things, Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden, that he and Eve wanted to be their own gods and make their own choices. Don't tell us what we can and cannot do. We'll decide. Thank you very much. That sin, the belief that the world has to revolve around me and my clan and my tribe and my culture, my ethnicity, my faith, leads to all sorts of selfish behaviors, including war. My experience is that human beings are prepared to fight and kill in the name of just about anything, be it a god or a political philosophy like National Socialism or communism, or patriotism, or tribe, or race, or any number of things. And the vast majority of wars have been conducted in the pursuit of profit, power, or waged for territory or tribal supremacy. But this all said, to argue, as in the third bullet point, that religion has nothing to do with violence is clearly also seriously misguided, if not nonsensical. It is certainly true that religion can moderate the use of force, with some religious convictions providing the sole compelling reason for refusing to kill or for seeking peace. But there is no avoiding the fact that in the service of the wrong people, religion can be a force of great harm. Critics of religion have lots to work with when they consider the sins of the past. There is plenty of blood on the hands of the faithful. As 14-year-old Malala, you may remember that young Afghanistan girl, sat on a bus in the grounds of the school, in Pakistan's Swat Valley, a gunman shot her in the head. After proudly claiming responsibility, the Taliban told the world that the teenager's educational activity represented a new chapter of obscenity, and we have to finish that chapter. The obscenity was the education of girls. The Taliban felt no shame. They knew that what they did was right because their God told them so. In the same way, gods have been used to justify almost any cruelty, from stoning adulterers to burning heretics. The men who flew planes into the buildings on 9/11, the Pakistanis who went on a murderous campaign in Mumbai, and the Mali bombers all killed as many people as they could in the name of their religion. Andres Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto revealed at best a weak attachment to religious belief. But he nonetheless justified his murderous spree as he slaughtered 77 Norwegians on his Christianity. Like the devotedly religious Taliban, he also appeared to feel no shame. Religion is very good at conferring a sense of moral superiority on its followers. My experience is that terrorism occurs when you combine a sense of military inferiority with a sense of moral superiority. And radicalism and extremism often take their seeds from exaggerating religious obligations and going well beyond what is taught. Sadly, thinking that theirs is the true religion make many take the law into their own hands. Justifying their acts in the name of religion, individuals and states all too often invoke holy war, defining the battles as a struggle against Satan, condemning unbelievers to death, and committing murder whilst declaring that God is great. Religions may all try to define themselves in terms of being a religion for peace, but most, if not all, have given rise to violence at some points in their history. Religions may seek peace, but all too often it's on their own terms, which is not a recipe for peace, but all too often a recipe for war. And it isn't confined to arguments between different religions. 500 years or so ago, much of North and Western Europe was utterly fed up with what it saw as the self-serving power of the Catholic Church. And in 1517, a little-known academic and theologian in a small, obscure German town wrote a lengthy tract to his local archbishop complaining about the sale of indulgences, the selling of pardons to wealthy sinners whenever the church needed some money. I doubt that Martin Luther had any intention of starting the storm that he did, but he is the undoubted father of the Reformation and the counter-Reformation that followed. Exploiting the anger, within 4 years of publishing the thesis in 1521, he declared Pope Leo X the Antichrist. With the invention of the printing press, ideas that would have actually been voiced earlier by people like John Wycliffe in Oxford spread across Europe like wildfire. Within 15 days, Luther's proclamation started to appear throughout Germany, and by 1546, 430 separate editions of his biblical translations had appeared in print. In England alone, more than 1 million Bibles and New Testaments were published between 1517 and 1640. And the result was a series of long and bloody wars in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe between Catholic and Protestant Christians. A series of wars that saw the beginning of the end of the Holy Roman Empire, the transformation of the map of Europe, and the killing of a very large chunk of the European population. Wars between Catholics and Huguenots in France from 1562 to 1598 was followed by the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, in which untold numbers died until it was ended by the Treaty of Westphalia. Whilst Wikipedia may be right, religion nonetheless clearly played an important part here. In the middle of it all, Henry VIII embarked on the first hard Brexit when he broke with Rome in 1534 and formed the Church of England with himself at the heart. Having been awarded the Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X by defending the established church, Henry was hardly a reformist. What he sought was distinctly earthly, the money and wealth of the English church that it had accrued over the centuries, and as well as the removal of a competing power in the land. He also, of course, wanted a divorce from his first wife, the Spanish Catherine of Aragon, which Rome had refused to grant. But the result was centuries of anti-Catholic prejudices in this country, including the serious persecution of Catholics until relatively recently. All of this sits alongside and builds into our fourth option, that their religion is the cause of violence, not ours, which is a classic example of in-group bias. Almost invariably, people regard their group as superior to others, be that an army regiment or a football team or a religious sect. Groups, like individuals, have a sort of need for self-esteem. A guy called Henry Tajfel, one of the pioneers of social identity theory, showed how deeply this runs even in the most trivial of groupings. In one experiment, he divided people up into groups on the basis of a mere toss of a coin. Yet they still rated the members of their own group as more likable than the others, despite the fact that they'd never met one another before and knew that they had been selected on a pretty random basis. I have to tell you, I saw the same when I arrived at Sandhurst. Allocated to a bunch of individuals I'd never previously met, we soon realized that we were superior to every other platoon at the academy, which was confirmed when we won the prestigious Sovereign's Cup. We didn't actually kill anybody in doing so, but we came pretty close to it from time to time. People will work hard to convince their sense of superiority and often violently defend it, if necessary, be that on the battlefield or on a football pitch. What's happening in the Middle East and elsewhere reflects a deep divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims over who would succeed Muhammad, a dispute which goes back to the Battle of Karbala 1,000 years ago. Killings and beatings and cruelty by people like ISIS continue to this day on that basis. In one recent year alone, over 30,000 of the 33,000 or so people killed around the world by terrorism, they were Muslims killed by fellow Muslims. Next slide, please, which I think is a blank. I've tried to show that violence has no religion, and that whilst religion can be a compelling reason for refusing to kill or for seeking peace, the abuse of it can nonetheless be a serious contributor to violence. But it certainly doesn't cause all wars, and neither does the lack of it bring peace. So both, however, as I said earlier, in the answer to the question, but also perhaps neither. What do I mean by that? I was once told that to live a contented life, we need three things: a real sense of identity, a strong sense of purpose, and a deep sense of faith. Identity, who am I? Purpose, why am I here? And faith, how should I live my life? Secularization has left us with a maximum of choice and a minimum of meaning, and it's hard to live life without meaning, which is why religious faith has usually re-emerged and indeed grown inside brutal, non-religious regimes. And I think it may be one of the reasons why we're seeing the rise of the quiet revival. A lot of young people living in a world of atheism and secularism asking themselves some pretty sensible questions. Secularism is often portrayed as a neutral, non-faith position. Indeed, as a position that isn't really a position itself. Quite clearly not the case. Although secularists and others don't like the idea much, everybody is a person of faith. We all see the world through the prism of our beliefs. We make our moral and ethical choices as a result, whether that prism is a religious or non-religious prism. Earlier in my time in the military, I became a Christian, serving in Cyprus actually at the time, as a result of visiting the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. The guide that day, which happened to be Easter Sunday and my 30th birthday, was a retired British Army colonel. And he challenged me to forget about religion and concentrate on Jesus. I did so, and some weeks later I became a disciple of Christ. He became the prism through which I then viewed the world. And the truth is, I'm not a great fan of religion, and I'm pretty sure Jesus wasn't either. The stark reality is that he was born into a world of violence and injustice, a world of corruption and the abuse of power, both by the religious and secular establishments. It was a world where men, women, and children suffered at the hands of tyrants and puppet kings like Herod, a vicious, self-centered and insecure thug who ordered the death of every boy aged 2 or under in the vicinity of Bethlehem when he heard about the birth of Jesus. But they also suffered, the people suffered, at the hands of the religious authorities, who, apart from anything else, of course, arranged for Christ's crucifixion. And 2,000 years later, Bethlehem is still locked inside a deeply divided country. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. Jesus himself said that he hadn't come to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. And that we will hear of wars and rumors of wars, and that nations will rise up against nations and kingdom against kingdom, which apparently they have done for all except 280 of the last 3,500 years of history. So in all of that, where is peace? Next slide, please. The Dutch philosopher Spinoza said that peace is not an absence of war. It is a virtue, a state of mind, a disposition for benevolence, confidence, justice. And Paul said that the peace of God passes, transcends all understanding. And I would say that both of them are, of course, right. Which is why Jesus' peace is a peace that the world cannot give. Jesus' peace is a peace that the world cannot give. Largely, indeed, doesn't even understand. It's not an absence of war, nor is it about a pain-free or crisis-free life. Christ said many things about peace, but not once did he associate it with the world as a whole, but rather with an individual and inner spiritual peace. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Being more or less religious won't solve our problem, which is why when Martin Luther King Jr. confronted racism in the white church in the South of America, he didn't call on those churches to become more religious. He called on them to become more Christ-like. King knew that the answer to racism and violence was a deeper faith in Jesus. His leadership of the civil rights struggle remains a great example of a costly and courageous resistance to evil, which often does need confronting, sadly, often with violence. Words like sin and evil are not interesting theological words to me. They are a reality of a broken, fallen world, and they need to be confronted. Last slide, please. So, the reason for my answers to the question is that for me, and perhaps surprisingly for some to hear, a great number of soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women, is that in Jesus I have found the answers to the questions of identity and purpose. I have found his peace amidst conflict, war, and the turmoil of life, a peace which is available to everyone, even to brutal tyrants and terrorists. So both and neither. And I hope that for most, if not all of you here, you have also found Christ's peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. We had an extraordinary range of speakers, actually, and we've all been very different. And the one next month will be Tim Vine, the comedian, but this is a different Tim. I think the challenging issue, and we'll go to questions in a moment, is reflected to me in the papers in a file I have at home, which my father, when he went to his conscientious objector tribunal during the beginning of World War II, he felt that he could not pull the trigger, but he realized that he had a responsibility nationally to be part of the war effort. So he went into prisoner of war camp in uniform, in prisoner of war camp administration as a non-combatant. But thinking about this idea of killing people, the story is told, I was the vicar of Albury for 10 years, otherwise known as Dibley. And on Albury Heath in 1944, prior to D-Day, Montgomery particularly addressed the Canadian troops on Albury Heath. And I took part when I was there in a celebration service with a drum, a drum service and all that stuff, etc. The story is told that a boy in the village was walking up to Albury Heath, because on Albury Heath is where the school is, and he was walking from the village up the school, and an army vehicle stopped and offered him a lift. You heard this story.
I have, yeah.
People haven't heard it, if I'm getting it correct. Driving the vehicle was Montgomery, or with his staff car. And the boy, he said to the boy, he said, "What did your dad do?" He said, "My dad's a cowman with the Albury estate." And then the boy said to him, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a field marshal." He says, "What do field marshals do?" "I kill people." The boy said, "Please could I get out of the car?" I think that's roughly the story.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you cope with the notion of personal responsibility within a framework that is, in its baldest terms, some kind of killing machine?
Sure. I mean, you won't be too surprised to know that I'm asked to and often lecture on that issue, so we could spend another 45 minutes exploring it, but I won't do that. I mean, we need to be quite clear. The military, the army, the British Army is in place to deliver fighting power. There are no prizes for coming second on a battlefield. The aim is to win. And fighting power consists of a number of issues, which we haven't got time to go into, but including amongst them, of course, is, if necessary, the need to fight and win, which means killing people, casualties on a battlefield. Now, when I became a Christian in 1981, I was a captain at the time, you won't be too surprised to know that I had to think through, well, can I stay in the military as a Christian? So I had to explore the scriptures and speak with various people before making the decision to A, accept Christ, and B, stay in the military. And there are lots of interesting examples from Scripture about soldiers and conversations that went on. So, for example, a whole raft of people go and see John the Baptist. Some of you remember the story. John the Baptist is baptizing, and a whole raft of different people go to see him. Amongst them is a group of soldiers. And they asked John the Baptist, "What must we do to be saved?" I've always felt his answer was a bit unfair, really, because he said, "Be content with your pay." What did he mean by that? Well, he meant don't abuse your power. He didn't say to them, in order to be saved, you must leave the army. They were part of an occupying power, and they would that occupying power would abuse its power, and there would often be, various ways of abusing that power amongst the community in all sorts of ways, and making extra money. So basically what he says was, you're soldiers, but don't abuse your power. Be content with your pay. Jesus, of course, meets a centurion whose servant is ill. And there's a long conversation we haven't got time to go into. But in the end, Jesus says, "I'll come and heal your servant." And the centurion says to him, "You don't need to go anywhere. I'm a man in command. I tell soldiers what to do, to come, to go. And they do what I tell them to do. All you need to do," he said to Jesus, "is give the word of command, and my servant will be healed." And Jesus turned around and said to people, "I have never found faith like this anywhere in Israel." This is a centurion of an occupying military power. There are lots of other examples of what goes in. Peter's visit to Cornelius, probably the first non-Jewish family to be baptized into the Christian faith. Cornelius is another Roman centurion. So it's quite clear to me that there's nothing that says in Scripture that you cannot serve as a Christian in the military. Indeed, we must have Christians in the military, as we need them in politics, in economics, in the banking system, in education, and in every other aspect of life. The issue is, how do you then live your life as a Christian in the military? And again, we could talk about various aspects of that in terms of leadership and so on. But I then come back, having said that, to having studied the Scriptures and thought about this a lot and prayed about it and so forth. I said what I said earlier. Sin and evil are not interesting theological words to me. They are a reality. Soldiers are not daft. When they look at mass graves being dug up, when they look at the ethnic cleansing, when they look at what the IRA and the UDF did to each other with shootings and beatings and kneecapping and all sorts of stuff, they ask themselves, what's going on here? Well, what's going on takes us right back to the Garden of Eden, to the beginning, creation story in Genesis chapter 1, when essentially we, humanity, made the choice that we would make our own choices. And we made that decision, and we're living with the consequences of that. And therefore, if we're not prepared to stand up to brutality and evil and so forth, then I just think we end up by living in a worse world. So I'm quite clear in my own mind, and I know many pacifists, and I think God calls people into different ways of, all of this stuff, but I'm quite clear that I continue to serve in the military, to serve as best I could as a Christian, and sometimes that involves going on operations where people will die. But if we don't stand up to tyranny, if we don't stand up to the brutality of terrorism and people like Putin and all these others I talked about, then we're going to live in a much more dangerous and difficult world.
Questions? Simon.
Tim, listening to you talking there, it seemed to sit somewhere between history, politics, religion, and I was reading recently a survey said that the new Archbishop of Canterbury, if and whenever that person is ever appointed, should not stick their nose into politics, was the particular one they talked about. The context, I think, was migration at the time when Stephen Cottrell was talking. What should the role of the church be? Should it concentrate on the salvation of individual souls, or should it stick its wellies into these bigger issues?
I think that was Lord Carey that was saying that the next Archbishop should stay out of politics. My own view is that, we live in the world we live in, and the church is in society, and politics is a hugely important driver of society. The question is, how do you engage with politics, and what is our primary purpose? And I think Justin Welby I happen to know quite well for various reasons, and I've got a huge amount of time for Justin, and frankly I don't think he should have resigned. It's a different issue really, but Justin did involve himself in, much more so than previous archbishops, in politics. The danger is when you engage yourself in politics, you inevitably engage yourself with the media, and the media then begin to pull you apart in all sorts of different ways. So the balance between speaking into the political realities of living in UK in this case, or indeed speaking into the worldwide affairs, is difficult, and it's not easy to get that balance right. And I think it is a fair criticism to say that probably Justin overdid it. And Lord Carey, I think, is saying, let's get back to the principal purpose of the church, which ultimately I think is the principle of the purpose of the church, which is to preach the gospel. Our role in life is to bring people into the kingdom, to draw people closer to the kingdom of heaven. And that must be our primary purpose. But that doesn't mean we can just ignore what's going on around us in society and walk away from it. So I think we have to engage with what's going on, and I think there are some issues that the church, frankly, has not been prepared to speak into with anywhere near, in my view, sufficient force. We will all have our views, and this is one of the problems as we go into this, we'll all have our views on issues like assisted suicide, like the rates of abortion. 250,000 babies a year are aborted in England and Wales every year. Church seems to say nothing, has to say nothing about this. The assisted suicide debate, to be fair, there has been comment about it, but those sorts of issues, I think the church has a duty to speak into. But how it does it, and when it does it, and where it does it, is the trick, really. So I would argue our principal purpose is to serve Christ and to bring people closer to the kingdom. But in doing that, those people live in the real world. They're surrounded by politics and the media and everything else, and we can't isolate ourselves from it. It's how we do it that's important. And your work on Premier Christian Radio and so forth, speaking into this, is part of that. And we can't walk away. I don't think we can walk away from it.
Another question? Sarah.
Hi. I'm finding it really difficult to know how to pray for Israel, Gaza, Hamas. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts you can offer on how, as Christians, we think about it, how we pray for it.
Yeah. Thank you. And clearly, it's I think it's on a lot of our hearts, really. I'm involved in a sort of prayer support team for Ukraine, actually, trying to think through how we get the Orthodox churches to talk to one another, so that when the war is over, how do we build the peace between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? So how do you build peace after conflict is finished is one issue, and what's that going to look like in the Middle East? I've been perfectly honest about it. I was born in 51. I don't remember 56, but we were coming back. My father worked for Shell, and we lived in Australia, and we had to come around the long way in 56 because the first of the big Arab-Israeli wars was going on. Then I remember the wars, 67, 73, when Israel and all that had happened in World War II and the way the State of Israel had been formed, I was just naturally on Israel's side. I supported Israel from a purely secular military point of view, if you like. But we need to be clear that Israel, Old Testament biblical stuff, Israel is the chosen nation, etc., etc. So I am instinctively on Israel's side. I think what happened on October the 7th was a deliberate plan by Hamas to force Israel to respond to the hostages and all the rest of it that went on that day, because Israel were beginning to build good relationships with many of the Arab states. The Abraham Accords was beginning to succeed. Saudi Arabia were talking about having a relationship with Israel. And of course Iran, which is the guys heading up Hezbollah and Hamas effectively, were desperate to try and stop this happening. So I think they deliberately carried out the attack on October the 7th in such a terrible way that Israel would be forced to respond. And I think Israel had to respond. And I have never had a problem with the fact that they've had to respond. Where we are today, of course, the question is, how are they responding? Are they using too much force? Are they, killing too many people, etc., etc.? And the problem with the way that, from a military point of view, the problem with the way that Israel is going about this under Netanyahu is, first of all, Netanyahu says he's going to destroy Hamas. He will not destroy Hamas. You do not destroy an idea. All you can do is degrade and take out quite a lot of the military capability. The other problem is, if you imagine any conflict like an archery target, in the middle of that target is the bullseye, and then you've got an inner circle and an outer circle. This analogy I've used a lot over the years for Northern Ireland and for various other places, but the same applies in Gaza and in Israel today. The bullseye is made up of very brutal, hard people who are prepared to kill and blow up and shoot people, etc., etc. That's the hard Hamas center. In Northern Ireland, it was the hard IRA center, and indeed the hard UDA and UVF center too. But actually a relatively small number of people in the context of the overall campaign. The inner circle is made up of people who would never shoot and blow people up and kill people, but are deeply sympathetic to the cause. So they will hide weapons, they will fund the terrorism, they fund the war, and so on and so forth. And the outer circle is made up of people who would not do either of those things, but they are sympathetic to the cause. So in Northern Ireland, for example, I don't think there were ever any more than about 1,000 hard, brutal terrorists in that core center. There were probably 10 times that number in the inner circle, and probably 100 times that number in the outer circle. You have to going back in a way to the earlier question, in my mind, you have to go after that hardcore center as part of your campaign. You have to be prepared to kill these brutal thugs who are going to go around, blow people up, etc. But you have to recognize that if you don't do that well, whatever that looks like, all that happens is you kill a lot of people in the hardened center, and you draw people in from the inner circle into the center, and you draw people from the outer circle into the inner circle. And all that Israel has been doing over the last couple of years is creating a new generation of youngsters who will be in the hard core of that target. And therefore they will not destroy Hamas. You have to win the battle of ideas. So I don't like the way they are conducted in the military campaign. There are lots of arguments from a military point of view that in some respects they're conducting a campaign very cleverly from a military point of view and using a lot of technology and so forth. But overall, I don't think they're conducting it well. So your basic question, how do we pray? When I'm asked about this for Ukraine and other things too, my answer is we need to pray for wisdom and leadership. We need to pray for somehow that the Holy Spirit will get inside the minds and the hearts of the people who are making the key decisions. Difficult though that is to understand, difficult though that is to believe it is possible when it comes to people like Hamas, or indeed people like Netanyahu, I have to say, or indeed people like Putin. But ultimately, I think we need to pray for wisdom for the strategic leadership, alongside, of course, praying for the people who are suffering and the casualties day to day. And the wisdom for that leadership is, eventually this thing will have to stop. There'll have to be negotiation. It's very unusual for any war to finish in the way that World War II finished, for example. Most things end up with some sort of negotiated settlement. So what does that look like? And to be fair to Trump, whatever we think of Trump, and we'll all have different views, this latest plan is at least an attempt to get people around the table and get them negotiating with one another. So we need to pray for Trump, and we need to pray for that plan, and we need to pray for the people involved, the leadership around the table. And somehow they will, they'll come up with some agreed solution. But it's tough. It's very tough. And the bottom line is there are no simple answers to this. And sometimes, I only speak for myself, but sometimes you just say, Lord, what on earth's going on here? Why do you allow this to happen? To which the answer is, I didn't want it to happen. That goes back to the Garden of Eden. The other part of the answer is, I put my son into the battlefield with you. He's there amongst the blood and the mud and the hardships and the sacrifice. And ultimately, that's what he died for. And, that to some that would be quite a trivial comment to make, but actually I believe it passionately. If Christ did not rise from the dead, this was my garden tomb experience, when this colonel said to me, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we're all wasting our time as Christians. It's on the basis of his sacrifice for us, and in the blood and the mud and the turmoil and the chaos and the uncertainty and the fear and all the other things. So we need to pray that somehow the wisdom and the Holy Spirit will get into these places and these people. But let's not kid ourselves that it's going to happen quickly or that it happens easily, because it doesn't.
Tim, thanks for that. And on that note, I think we need to finish. Just to say how much we appreciate your coming, and also the way in which you've unpacked these incredibly difficult issues that we face. And most of us here are post-war people. If you're like me, you're a super boomer, born in the dark winter of 1947. But I remember reading about what happened in Dresden, for example, in reflecting on what's going on in Gaza City now. And I just feel that we put ourselves in the hands of a God of peace, and yet in this tension that you've described, we have this challenge really to faith and to trust and to pray for you and for people in the military. Our old vicar Martin Wainwright, of course, is a chaplain, and others have had family associations with the military. And I guess somebody once said, didn't they, it's relatively easy to win the war, but it's much more difficult to win the peace. So thank you for coming. Let's give Tim a round of applause. Shall we?